Welcome. Today we're looking at a story that is, well, it's as much about psychology as it is about music. We're talking about Simon and Garfunkel.
Right.
To the casual listener, you hear the name and you immediately think of this pristine sound. It's something that just completely defined a big part of the 1960s.
Absolutely. They were one of the best-selling acts of the decade.
And of all time, really. I mean, the numbers are staggering, over 100 million records sold.
Hmm.
But if you look just beneath the surface of those perfect harmonies, you find something else entirely. It's a dual narrative.
It really is. On one side, you have this incredible, immense commercial success.
And on the other, you have this incredibly volatile personal relationship that spanned decades. It just swung back and forth between, being like brothers and then complete estrangement.
It's a dynamic that's really rare in creative partnerships.
How so?
Well, usually when a personal relationship fractures to that degree, the professional one just ends. It's a clean break.
Right. It's over.
But with Simon and Garfunkel, what we see is this recurring cycle. They come together, they create something massive, something truly iconic.
And then the friction, that same personal friction, just pushes them apart again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our task here is to really examine how that friction might have actually fueled their art. We're going to look at the whole timeline, from their childhood in Queens right up to the most recent updates on their relationship.
And just to be clear before we start, we're going to be unpacking some pretty intense personal conflicts here. There are betrayals, there are legal disputes, public insults. Our goal is to report on what our sources say and to do it impartially. We're not taking sides between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. We're just laying out the history of what happened.
Precisely. We're examining the mechanics of the relationship and how it influenced the work they made together.
So let's start at the very beginning. The origin story doesn't begin in the 1960s folk scene like most people assume.
Not at all. It starts much earlier.
It begins in Kew Gardens Hills, Queens, New York. We're in the early 1950s. This was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and these two kids, they grew up just 3 blocks away from each other.
Right. They went to the same schools, Public School 164, then Parsons Junior High, and then Forest Hills High School. They were on the same track the whole way.
And they were both just completely immersed in the radio culture of the time. They were fascinated by the birth of rock and roll.
And specifically, the close harmony singing of groups like the Everly Brothers. That influence it's absolutely critical to their entire sound.
They actually met in 1953. They're in elementary school.
And they get cast in a 6th grade play, an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. Paul was the White Rabbit. Art was the Cheshire Cat.
That's the spark. Right after that, they start singing together. They form this little street corner doo-wop group called the Peptones with a few other friends.
And this is where they really learned to harmonize. It wasn't just a hobby for them either. Yeah. They were performing at school dances, getting a feel for an audience.
By 1956, they're already writing their own material.
And you have to note the level of ambition here, even at that age. In 1956, Paul Simon's father actually sends a handwritten copy of their first song.
Which was called The Girl for Me.
Yes. He sends it to the Library of Congress to register a copyright.
Wow.
That tells you they were treating this as a serious potential career from a very, very young age.
Absolutely. And that ambition leads to their first real brush with the music industry. So the story goes, they were trying to remember the lyrics to an Everly Brothers song, Hey Doll Baby.
And they couldn't quite get it, so they just ended up writing their own version, an imitation of it.
And that became Hey Schoolgirl.
Exactly. They scraped together $25 and went into a studio in Manhattan, Sanders Recording Studio, to record a demo of it.
And just by chance, a promoter named Sid Prosen heard them while they were there.
Right. He pulls them aside, he talks to their parents, and he signs them to his independent label, Big Records.
And you have to remember, they were only 15 years old at this point.
Which brings us to their first identity shift.
Yeah.
Because they didn't release this music as Simon and Garfunkel.
No, they were Tom and Jerry.
Art Garfunkel became Tom Graff. The Graff was a reference to his love for mathematics. He literally liked to track the hits on graph paper.
And Paul Simon became Jerry Landis. He took the last name from a girl he was dating at the time.
So, Hey Schoolgirl is released in 1957.
And it was a hit. I mean, a real legitimate hit. It sold over 100,000 copies.
It reached number 49 on the Billboard charts.
But the story behind that success, it reveals a lot about how the music industry worked back then.
It sure does.
Sid Prosen, their promoter, he used the payola system.
He bribed the most famous DJ at the time, Alan Freed.
How much?
$200. He paid him $200 to play the song.
And that's all it took. Suddenly, the song becomes a nightly staple on Freed's radio show.
Which then gets them a spot on American Bandstand. They performed right after Jerry Lee Lewis.
So they're on their way. But the financials, well, they tell a very different story about who was actually benefiting from this success.
It's a very different story.
They earned, what, about $4,000 total from the song?
Something like that. It was their 2% royalty cut.
Meanwhile, the vast majority of the profits stayed right with Sid Prosen.
But, the money wasn't the issue that caused the first major rift between them.
No, that happened the next year, in 1958.
This is what we could call the True Taylor incident. It's a pivotal moment.
So what happened?
While they were still a duo, still signed to big records as Tom and Jerry, Paul Simon went and released a solo single.
Behind Garfunkel's back?
Yes. It was a song called True or False, and he released it under the name True Taylor.
And Garfunkel's reaction to this?
He saw it as a profound betrayal. From his point of view, they were a team, a partnership. And for Simon to go behind his back like that, it just shattered the trust between them.
So this is really the original sin of their relationship.
If you look at the entire trajectory of their career, you can trace so much of the tension back to this moment. It established this foundation of, emotional friction that never really went away.
It planted a seed of doubt.
A seed of suspicion in Garfunkel that Simon would eventually leave him behind. Or maybe that Simon always saw himself as a solo entity who just happened to be working with a partner for the time being.
After high school graduation in 1958, the Tom and Jerry success kind of fizzled out.
It did. They released a couple more singles that went nowhere, and so they moved on. They went into what we might call an academic interlude.
Pursuing backup careers, just in case.
Right. Simon went to Queens College to study English. He even briefly enrolled in Brooklyn Law School.
And Garfunkel went to Columbia College. He studied architecture first, and then he switched to art history.
But they didn't stop music entirely. It just became more of a side gig, a gig economy situation.
Simon was especially active during this time, wasn't he?
Oh, very. He was working with Carole King and Jerry Goffin, recording demos for them for $25 a song. He was still releasing music under various aliases, like Jerry Landis and Paul Kane.
And Garfunkel recorded a few solo tracks as well under the name Artie Gar.
Right. But they were drifting. They were in the industry, but they were doing it separately.
The big reunion happens in 1963. They had both graduated from college by then, and the entire musical landscape had shifted.
Rock and roll was on the wane, and the folk revival was just exploding in Greenwich Village.
So they reunite, but with a new focus. Not rock and roll anymore.
No, now it's all about folk music. They start performing at places like Gerdshoek City.
And they're using a new name again, Kane and Gar.
And this leads them to the pivotal audition. They managed to get a meeting with Tom Wilson at Columbia Records.
Tom Wilson was a major figure.
A huge figure. He was the guy who would later be the key architect of Bob Dylan's famous transition to electric rock. At this moment, though, he was just looking for new folk acts.
And what did they play for him?
They played The Sound of Silence.
And Wilson signed them on the spot.
Immediately.
So this brings us to their first album under the name Simon and Garfunkel. It was called Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m., released in 1964.
And historically, we look back at this as a classic album. But at the time,
it was a complete commercial failure.
An absolute disaster.
It sold only 3,000 copies.
Yep.
For a major label release. That's just catastrophic.
The failure was so total that the group essentially broke up again.
Right. Simon packs his bags and moves to England. He figures his American music career is over.
And Garfunkel just goes back to university to continue his studies in mathematics.
But Simon's time in England is really important for his development as a songwriter.
Incredibly important. He's touring these small folk clubs. He's meeting and playing with figures like Bert Jansch and Al Stewart. He's absorbing everything.
This is also where he meets Kathy Chitty.
His muse. She's the Kathy in Kathy's song. She's the one he's singing about in America.
He even recorded a solo album while he was over there, the Paul Simon Songbook, in 1965.
So as far as he's concerned, the Simon and Garfunkel chapter is closed.
But back in the United States, something very strange was happening.
Yes. A DJ in Boston, a guy named Dick Summer, started playing the original acoustic version of The Sound of Silence from that failed album.
And it started to catch on.
It started to get traction with college audiences in Boston and then down in Florida. A little cult following was starting to build.
And this is where Tom Wilson, the producer, intervenes again.
And he does it in a way that just completely changes music history. Wilson sees that folk rock is becoming the next big thing.
Mostly because of what he himself was doing with Bob Dylan.
Exactly. So he decides to take their acoustic recording of The Sound of Silence.
And without telling Simon or Garfunkel?
Without informing them at all, he brings in the studio musicians who had just played on Dylan's, like a Rolling Stone, electric guitar, bass, drums.
And he just overdubs them onto the acoustic track.
He just lays them right on top.
I mean, just imagine that. The artist isn't even in the country, let alone the room. Simon is in England, completely unaware this is happening.
Wilson releases this remixed version as a single, and it just takes off like a rocket.
It hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January of 1966.
So Paul Simon is in Denmark, and he picks up a copy of Billboard magazine and sees his song at #1.
And his reaction wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't gratitude.
No. He was reportedly horrified when he finally heard it.
Why?
He was a folk purist at that stage. He had just spent a year immersing himself in the English folk scene. This electric backing track, to him, it felt like a violation of the song's integrity. It felt alien.
But you can't really argue with a #1 hit.
You cannot. And that success forced them back together, whether they wanted it or not. CBS demanded a follow-up album immediately to capitalize on the single.
And this was a total rush job. The album, which became Sounds of Silence, was recorded in just 3 weeks.
An incredibly short amount of time.
What they did was, they essentially took a bunch of songs from Simon's solo UK album, the Paul Simon Songbook.
And just re-recorded them with this new folk rock sound. They basically gave them the Sound of Silence treatment.
And it worked. Homeward Bound, I Am a Rock, they became huge hits as well.
But the critics were skeptical.
They saw them as manufactured.
Exactly. Because of the whole overdubbing story and this sudden shift in style, they were initially derided as a manufactured imitation of authentic folk music. They were seen as capitalizing on a trend rather than leading it.
And that criticism really bothered them.
It did. And as they moved into their next phase around 1966, you see the dynamic between them change significantly.
How so?
For their next album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, Paul Simon insisted on having total creative control.
No more producers making decisions behind their backs.
Precisely. And they went from recording an album in 3 weeks to spending 9 months in the studio.
That's a massive shift.
It is. This is the point where they truly become producers. Art Garfunkel specifically cited the recording of Scarborough Fair as the moment they, alongside their engineer Roy Haley, really took charge.
They were obsessing over every single sonic detail. Layering vocals, experimenting with sounds.
This was their response to being called manufactured. They were going to prove their artistry.
And at the same time, their manager, a man named Mort Lewis, he started to cultivate a very specific image for them.
Right. He refused to let them go on television unless they had complete control over the set list and the presentation.
He wanted them to come across as
alienated, weird, poetic. Those were the words he used.
And it worked. They were becoming the intellectual, serious alternative to the standard pop groups of the day.
And that carefully crafted image, that's what attracted the attention of Hollywood.
Specifically, the director Mike Nichols.
Yes. Nichols was filming what would become The Graduate, and he became obsessed with their music. He was listening to it constantly while editing. He felt it captured the exact tone of the film.
And he wanted to use it in the movie.
He did. But Simon was very resistant at first.
He was worried about selling out.
He was. He didn't want his songs to just be used as background filler in a Hollywood movie. It felt cheap to him.
But they eventually agreed to a deal.
Their agent negotiated a deal for $25,000 for them to submit 3 new songs for the film.
But the interesting part is that Nichols rejected the first few songs Simon offered him.
He did. He didn't think Punky's Dilemma fit the mood at all.
So they're in a bind. The deadline is approaching.
And so they offer him this incomplete song. It was a work in progress that wasn't even about the movie. It was originally titled Mrs. Roosevelt.
They just changed the name.
They changed one word. They sang it for him as Mrs. Robinson, and Nichols just loved it. He said, it's now about Mrs. Robinson. It's not about Mrs. Roosevelt anymore.
And that song, Mrs. Robinson, it became a cultural phenomenon.
A massive one. It was the first rock and roll song to win the Grammy for Record of the Year, which was a huge deal in 1969.
It anchored their next album, Bookends, which came out in 1968.
And Bookends is really a masterpiece of production. It's a concept album, and the level of detail is just incredible.
To give you an idea of their perfectionism at this point.
They spent over 50 hours in the studio just recording the vocals for one track, Punky's Dilemma.
50 hours.
50 hours. They were recording vocal parts literally note by note, syllable by syllable, to get it absolutely perfect.
There's also a fascinating business story from the Bookends era that shows how savvy they had become.
Ah, the price hike dispute.
Right. Clive Davis, who was the head of Columbia Records, he wanted to raise the list price of the album by $1.
From $4.79 to $5.79. His excuse was that they were including a large poster with the album.
But really, he just knew it was a guaranteed bestseller and he wanted to maximize the profit for the label.
Simon refused. Point blank. He saw it as just charging their fans a premium, simply because they could. He thought it was greedy.
So what did he do?
He used that dispute as leverage. He said, okay, you want to raise the price, then we want a higher royalty rate.
And they got it.
They did. It showed that while their public image was of these sensitive, poetic types, they were very, very sharp when it came to their business interests.
So by 1969, they are arguably the biggest musical duo in the world. They're at the absolute peak of their powers.
And naturally, that's when the friction starts building again.
The catalyst this time was another movie.
Mike Nichols' follow-up to The Graduate, a film called Catch-22.
And Nichols cast both of them in the film. Garfunkel was set to play Captain Nately, and Simon was cast as a character named Dunbar.
But then the script was rewritten, and in the new version, Paul Simon's part was cut.
Just written out of the movie entirely.
Gone. But Garfunkel's part remained. So Art Garfunkel went off to Mexico for several months to film, leaving Simon behind in New York.
This was a massive blow to Simon's ego. He felt completely abandoned.
You can hear it in the music. He wrote the song The Only Living Boy in New York, specifically about this experience.
Tom, get your plane right on time. Tom, as in Tom Graff.
I know your part will go fine. It's all there. It's a song about Artie going off to become a movie star while he was just stuck waiting.
And to make matters worse, the filming of Catch-22 ran long. There were delays.
Significant delays, which meant Garfunkel could only return to the recording studio intermittently.
Which must have just destroyed the workflow for their new album.
It did. Simon was incredibly frustrated. He later wrote that he had this realization, if Artie becomes a big movie star, he's going to leave the duo. And Simon decided then and there, I don't need him. I can write the songs. I can sing the songs myself.
And right in the middle of all this personal tension, they produce a television special.
Songs of America in 1969.
And it was very politically charged for the time.
Very. It featured a lot of montage footage of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., the Vietnam War, the Poor People's March.
And the reception was not good.
It was hostile. The original sponsor, AT&T, pulled out. Another sponsor, Alberto Culver, objected to the content.
And the viewers.
Reports from the time say about 1 million viewers switched channels to watch figure skating instead. It was a polarizing moment that just added all this external pressure to their already intense internal conflict.
And yet, somehow, out of all this chaos and resentment,
comes their final studio album and their masterpiece.
Bridge Over Troubled Water, released in January 1970.
It's just so ironic, isn't it, that their most fractured, most painful period produced their most beloved and commercially successful work.
The numbers are just mind-boggling. It topped the charts in 10 different countries.
It was the best-selling album of 1970 and 1971 and 1972.
3 years in a row. It sold over 25 million copies worldwide. It's one of the best-selling albums of all time.
But the relationship was completely broken. The tensions during the recording were so high that Simon later said he just wanted out. He was done.
And the split wasn't some dramatic press conference.
No, it's very quiet. It was just a phone call to Clive Davis at the record label. Simon confirmed it was over.
And so began the long period of separation.
The first of many.
Throughout the 1970s, they both pursued solo paths. Simon, of course, had a hugely successful solo career, culminating in the monumental Graceland album in the 80s.
And Garfunkel had some hits as well. All I Know was a big one. And he continued to pursue acting, with significant roles in films like Carnal Knowledge and Bad Timing.
But they weren't completely estranged during this time, were they? There were these little brief reunions.
Glimmers of hope, you could call them. They did a benefit concert for the presidential candidate George McGovern in 1972.
In 1975, they recorded a new single together, My Little Town.
Which was interesting because they released it on both of their solo albums that year. A way of, sharing the credit.
They even hosted Saturday Night Live together in 1975 and performed a few songs.
But these were all just temporary truces. The real test, the big one, came in 1981.
New York City was in a pretty bad state at the time. Economically, culturally, there was a real decline.
Right. And a promoter named Ron Delsener came up with this idea to boost the city's morale. A huge, free concert in Central Park.
And he wanted Simon and Garfunkel to headline it.
The concert in Central Park, September 19th, 1981. It's just legendary.
Over 500,000 people showed up.
500,000 people. It was one of the largest concert audiences in history at that time.
And the commercial impact was massive. The live album went double platinum. HBO paid $1 million just for the broadcast rights.
Commercially, it was an absolute triumph. And it proved beyond any doubt that the public appetite for Simon and Garfunkel was completely undiminished.
So naturally, this leads to plans for a world tour and, even more excitingly, a brand new studio album.
And this is where we see the cycle repeat itself almost exactly.
The tour happened in 1982, but by the end of it,
They weren't speaking to each other again.
still, they went into the studio in 1983 to try and record this new album, which was initially titled Think Too Much.
And the sessions were a complete disaster from the start.
What was the issue this time?
The old issues. Garfunkel reportedly refused to learn the new songs the way Simon wanted him to. There were disputes over Garfunkel's use of cannabis and cigarettes in the studio, which Simon felt affected his voice.
But it was deeper than that.
It was. Simon felt the material was incredibly personal to him, and he didn't feel it could be a duo record if Garfunkel wasn't going to commit to it 100%. He felt art was just phoning it in.
So Simon makes a decision, a pretty ruthless one.
It's one of the most brutal moves in rock history, really. He takes the master tapes.
And he wipes Garfunkel's vocals from them. He just erases him from the album.
He erases him completely. And the material that was supposed to be the great Simon and Garfunkel comeback album was released as Paul Simon's solo album, Hearts and Bones.
That's more than a breakup. That's a profound rejection.
It's one thing to say we're done. It's another thing to digitally remove your partner's contribution from the work you just spent months creating together.
And that move really just froze their relationship for years. It brings us into what you could call the Cold War era of the 90s.
It does. A very Cold War.
In 1990, they're inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And they stood on stage together, but the tension was just... You could feel it through the screen.
Simon said in his acceptance speech, "Arthur and I agree on almost nothing."
But it's true. I have to thank him for that. It was a very backhanded compliment. They left the ceremony without speaking to one another.
And then in 1991, Simon stages his own massive solo concert in Central Park, a sequel to their big event.
And he explicitly declined Art Garfunkel's offer to perform a few songs with him. It was a very clear, very public signal that the partnership was not just dormant, it was dead.
However, as we've seen, the cycle eventually swings back. It always does.
In 2003, they received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. And that event seemed to thaw things out.
It sparked the Old Friends tour.
And again, the public response was just staggering.
The tour earned an estimated $123 million.
They played a free concert in Rome in 2004 in front of the Colosseum that drew 600,000 fans.
Even bigger than Central Park.
Much bigger. And for a while, it seemed like they had finally found a way to coexist. Maybe not as best friends, but as old friends, united by the legacy and, frankly, the business.
They were even planning another tour for 2010.
They were. But then a very bizarre medical incident occurred.
Art Garfunkel choked on a piece of lobster at a restaurant.
It sounds almost comical, but it caused a very serious injury. He suffered from vocal cord paresis, a partial paralysis of one of his vocal cords.
He lost his ability to sing.
He lost his upper register, which was so crucial to their harmony sound.
So the tour dates were all canceled?
They were postponed. Garfunkel's manager apparently told Simon he'd be ready to sing again in 6 months, maybe a year. But a year passed, and he still wasn't ready.
And Simon felt misled.
He did. He felt he'd been put in an impossible position, and the tour just fell apart. And with it, the relationship deteriorated once again.
This leads us to the period of very public sparring in the mid-2010s.
Yes. In a 2015 interview with The Telegraph, Garfunkel just let loose. He didn't hold back at all.
What did he say?
He called Simon an idiot and a jerk for walking away from their shared success all those years ago. He said, "How can you walk away from this lucky place on top of the world, Paul? What's going on with you, you idiot?" It was a very raw expression of his frustration.
And how did Simon respond?
A year later, in 2016, he was interviewed by the New York Times and was asked about a reunion. He just shut it down completely. He said he didn't enjoy the fractious relationship, and he was done with it. It really seemed like that was the final word.
The final nail in the coffin.
It certainly felt that way.
But, as we've learned, final is a very relative term when it comes to these two.
It is.
Which brings us to the very recent updates. Updates that really changed the ending of this biography quite significantly.
Yes. In November of 2024, Art Garfunkel gave an interview, and his tone was completely different.
He said he had been a fool.
He did. And he confirmed that he and Simon had reconciled as friends. He described a tearful reunion where he apparently apologized for his past behavior and his public comments.
And he made it clear this wasn't about a tour or about money.
No, it was about repairing the friendship before it was too late.
And then, even more recently, in April of 2025, he was asked about the possibility of a musical reunion.
And his answer was hopeful. He said, "We may give it a try and see where it leads."
Which is just a remarkable turnaround. After decades of betrayal and erasure and public insults, they seem to have circled all the way back to the beginning.
It's an astonishing postscript to their story.
So when we look at their legacy today, we see the accolades. 9 competitive Grammys, 4 Hall of Fame awards, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction.
But culturally, their impact was so much more than that. They were the bridge. They took the intellectualism of the folk establishment and made it accessible to the counterculture.
They provided the soundtrack for a whole generation of, alienated, thoughtful young people.
Sure did.
And personally, it seems they have finally transitioned from that famously fractious relationship to, at the very least, a tentative peace.
It's the story of two people who so clearly needed each other to reach their highest potential, even if, for most of their lives, they couldn't stand being in the same room.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
About what?
Well, it raises the question of whether great art sometimes requires that kind of friction. Would a song like Bridge Over Troubled Water have been as powerful as resonant if they had been getting along perfectly at the time?
It's impossible to know. But perhaps the tension is exactly what made the harmony so sweet.
That's certainly something to think about. Thanks for listening.